Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Elizabeth Fox, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Mobius Executive Leadership. And you're joining us today for part of our Mobius Cares seminar series, a group of free webinars that our senior experts have conducted on our behalf ever since the COVID pandemic began, to make available the expertise, resources, and information that our clients and their families might need to preserve, protect, and safeguard the well-being and mental health of their families during difficult moments. If you could, Julie, take us to the next slide. You will see a request to grant us permission to both record and stream this session live on Facebook so that we can make it available as widely as possible. Please give your approval to that so we can get started with the recording. And today I have the great privilege of welcoming you to a panel that is intended to respond to the adolescent mental health crisis that we're seeing after the pandemic, really globally. This is a panel designed to support parents and their family members. We're very grateful so many of you can be with us. As you may know, a few months ago, the New York Times reported or shared a CDC finding in a radical increase in teen depression, anxiety, eating disorders, self-harming, and suicidality. And I think it broke many of our hearts, or at the very least galvanized us to action. And as a result of that report, Egon Zehnder, Seven Stones Leadership, and Cultivating Leadership, three of our precious alliance partners, have come together with us today to host and gather this panel. In a moment, I'll have a chance to introduce our experts who will be guiding the discussion today. But first, let me just invite my dear friend, Francesco Buchino, who heads Leadership Advisory Services for Egon Zehnder, to join me in welcoming everyone. Francesco, thank you for your support.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone. My name is Francesco Buchino. I'm a partner at Egon Zehnder. I've been there for 15 years, so I'm a teenager in the firm, and so I very much empathize with the concept that our teenagers, and I'm a parent of two teenagers, are going through very tough times. I'm very happy to be here. I just want to share a very quick story. 2 weeks ago, I was at my daughter's high school graduation, and the class graduation speech was about this being the first class of high schoolers that graduated, that started high school and went into lockdown 2 months down the road. And the whole speech was around this, which suggests, and it was a funny speech, of course, as they should be, but it suggests that as we are discussing today, this mental health is really a crisis that we need to face, because we're all, as Egon Zehnder, we serve a lot of leaders, but many leaders are also parents, and the new generations are going to be the leaders of the future, so we need to act now on this. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Mobius, for inviting us to be a co-sponsor of this.
Wonderful. So without further ado, let me introduce formally our three panelists and then turn it over to them to guide our conversation together today, friends. So first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Torres, who we have the great privilege of having serve as our Director of Therapeutic Services at Mobius. Liz is a board-certified clinical psychologist and a master clinician specializing in evidence-based treatment of mood and anxiety disorders, as well as recovery from early attachment and developmental trauma. Additionally, she works extensively with couples facing challenges at every developmental stage. She's a former faculty member of Harvard Medical School's Department of Psychiatry at McLean Hospital in Boston. And Liz, we're delighted to have you both as a specialist today and the moderator of our panel. Let me also welcome our wonderful transformational faculty member, Wendy Denham. Dr. Denham is a clinical psychologist and a published researcher. She's the founder of a group practice for families and children in Los Angeles and has trained and supervised therapists nationally and internationally, also in evidence-based parenting interventions. She consults with parents with children of all ages and has a special interest in helping parents make sense of the complex factors that impact both child development and family flourishing. And then finally, Dr. Sanchit Maruti is an associate professor of psychiatry at Larner College of Medicine at the University of Vermont. He is also the medical director of the University of Vermont's Medical Center Inpatient Psychiatry Service and their addiction treatment program, and an attending psychiatrist there as well. His research interests include the areas of risk assessment and quality improvement. Sanchit also serves as the course director of an annual American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry and the treatment course there, and on the board of directors of the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry. We're really grateful that all three of you have volunteered to be with us today and share your vast expertise on this incredibly touching and poignant topic. And with that, let me welcome everyone and turn it over, Liz, to you to guide us.
Thank you so much. We are really excited to be here today. This is a serious topic. I know that if you're tuning in, this obviously means a lot to you. I have just almost finished my adolescence with my 3 children. My last one is 19, so I'm a survivor. And we are delighted to talk with you. We're going to be presenting some things. I want to say at the outset that all these slides will be available when the recording is uploaded, so you can download them later. Our Q&A is open right now. Feel free to put questions in there. Please, if it's on your mind, it's probably on other people's minds too, so go ahead and put it down. I'm going to be looking as we go and try to weave them in if it works. I want to say, though, while we're going to give input, it's really important that everyone understand we cannot give medical advice or consultation on a specific situation. This is, we like to look at this as like a thinking workshop together. We're going to be talking about these issues and reflect together. So we're also going to be taking turns on the slides. So next slide. So today we're going to start out by understanding kind of an overview of what adolescence is and what are the changes that are happening, what we can expect, and the data about mental health and adolescence. Next slide.
Well, it is such a pleasure to be here today with everybody. And while we're going to be talking about some of the crisis that we know is affecting adolescents, I think that we also wanted to start by giving an overview of just what is ordinary about adolescence and the developmental challenges of adolescence, which are very emotionally evocative for the kids themselves and for parents. But let's start with, again, what is ordinary. So, one of the things we know is that adolescents are working on identity formation, right? Separation and individuation are the big tasks. And that looks like a rejection of maybe old values, old belief systems, and often a rejection of parents, parents' values, parents' expectations. And that can, again, be very difficult, but again, it's very, very ordinary. One thing that often parents say to me is they say, I wonder where did my little kid go? Where did my affectionate little sweetie go? It feels like overnight they went from someone who wanted my opinion and wanted to, have my guidance into someone who doesn't seem to want to even spend time with me anymore. And so there's a lot of grief and loss, I think, for parents that happen during adolescence. One of the things I also wanted to point out about this slide is, and just in general, again, is this idea of, adolescents are really trying to figure out who they are. And we see them experimenting with lots of different identities, right? There's not a one-size-fits-all experience for any adolescent, but it can be, of course, confusing for the adolescent and also for the parent as we see them trying to find their tribe, a tribe that reflects their values, their experience. And again, in this changing world, there's so much more that children are exposed to and are aware of. And often I think that parents are finding themselves really needing to be open to being educated by their children, specifically, I think, in areas including kids who are neurodivergent, the LGBTQA plus community. So I think, again, just holding in mind that the more we can think about these ordinary developmental tasks on a regular basis, we'll have some context for seeing, again, what can we think of as part of the the pathway that we're going to be guiding our child through in an ordinary way, and then looking for these clues that maybe some things are more of a struggle than others. Next slide.
Thank you, Wendy. So as we think about what are adolescents, who are they, we want to think about the multifactorial aspects of what goes into that age between approximately 13 and 19. There is variability, some mature faster, some mature slower, but one of the hallmarks is very significant brain development. So on every level, motor skills, cognitive skills, emotional skills, a lot of development is happening. The other thing concurrently that's happening is a lot of hormonal changes. So specifically, many of the reproductive hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, and they will result in changes in body habitus. So in addition to our adolescents experiencing great shifts in how they think, how they perceive, how they conceptualize, they're also changing how they look. With that comes actual maturation, and they go into every part of the body. There are changes that are happening, everything from height to how they appear to the development of reproductive organs, etc. Along with this, as this is happening, and keep in mind that this has been ongoing for millennia, since our own founding, our first ancestors, we all went through this. We may not remember it in great detail, but along with this, there's a drive for independence, for autonomy, for a sense of selfhood that starts emerging much more. As Dr. Denham had said, that, there's a shift from one day being a child, an adorable child, someone who is with us and wants to do everything we want to do and is a shared part of the unit, to someone who starts leaning into other directions. And with that, one feels, what is my place in a social setting? And so in terms of the individuation, in terms of societal changes, in terms of the physical, cognitive, mental, there is a lot that's happening. What all of these changes do and how they converge is that one starts seeing much more increased desire for exploration, risk-taking activities, growth and development. And when we think about other people, there's a lot of emphasis on social networks. What is the value within the social network? Now, as we go through life, we still retain those things, but we have a perspective on where to value it. But when you are young, what your friends think about your hair, or whether you got picked for a team or not, that can have some pretty significant effects on you. And finally, as all of this is happening, and as Dr. Denham said earlier, there becomes a huge amount of evolution that's happening in the closest social networks that the individual had, which is with their parents, their siblings, their grandparents. So suffice to say, in a summary way, lots of internal changes, lots of external changes, and a lot of decision making that has effects on anxiety, on depression, on resilience, on growth, etc. Next slide, please.
It's so helpful to think about this and hear you speak about this too, Sanchit, because, when I think about parents speaking to me about adolescence, often what I'm hearing as well is we all have an idea and experiences right about adolescence or being an adolescent ourselves where there's extreme sensitivity, right, and irritability. And I think about, kids having meltdowns about whether they can do their hair right or what they look like in the mirror. And I think sometimes it can be, parents are like, how can this be a catastrophe? Why is there this level of emotion, right? This is sort of outsize for the problem at hand. And yet I think if we take into account everything that we've already spoken about, it's enormously scary to be entering this period of one's life. You're really feeling like you're supposed to be developing the skills to be a successful, right, adult. And there's a lot of fears that children have that they won't be successful. And I wanted to point out a couple of things on this slide that I really see in Los Angeles, where there's a lot of stress often about meeting academic goals and standards. I think about part of what's so tricky as well about adolescence is that, it's hard to be more reflective and slowed down when you're having intense emotions, and it can lead to a lot of black and white thinking. And so, often what I see is a sense of, if I don't get into this middle school or this high school or this college, my life is not going to be, I'm not going to be successful. I'm a failure. I'm a loser. And these self-identities are incredibly painful. And unfortunately, I think our culture can support more rigid and inflexible ways of thinking about what success looks like for our kids. And here we have these kids coming post-COVID as well, who are already trying to figure out what kind of world they live in. So I think again about all of these intense feelings, how important it is to be able to have some awareness and hopefully by sort of reflecting on all of these experiences, have some more compassion for what the journey of an adolescent is. One thing I also wanted to point out here is this idea of feelings of guilt and shame. I do think, again, that as much as children may look on the surface, or adolescents, as if they are doing what they want to do and maybe not heeding what parents say or their community says at times, I think adolescents feel enormous guilt and worry about being disappointing to their parents or community, not living up to expectations. And it's really difficult because, again, them trying to individuate and separate themselves from their parents does mean forging their own path. And those risky behaviors that are so challenging for parents are also ways that children are trying to test themselves in the world and see whether or not they can be successful. Next slide.
Thank you, Wendy. So when we think about this, as Amy had said at the beginning, that there's a lot of data that's emerging in a post-COVID world, that the health of adolescents is really in peril. You have the slides, and I'll have you read them as you can. But there are a few sort of key messages here, that in almost every category, we are seeing more acute aspects happening in the health of adolescents. So many more visits to the emergency department, many more admissions in inpatient settings. We also see that they're using mental health resources at a much higher level. And this is in the cases where the resources are available. Oftentimes, the resources are not even available. What we're also seeing is growing disparities. So when you have higher needs and lesser access to resources, you start seeing those disparities. Add all of this with what is happening in the world. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there were still conflicts, but many times they were sequestered to certain areas. But what is happening at this point is a combination effect. Everything from the results of climate change, from political unrest, social media pressures, ongoing isolation, ongoing fears, wars, conflicts, those type of things are really hitting home very hard. They hit home hard because for us, we're older, we have a sense of context. We know how to value it. But for people who are just beginning their lives, they don't know what this means for them and their future. And what it does is it contributes to one of the most pernicious things we can experience, which is uncertainty. So the adolescents are experiencing so much change, as I had said earlier, but also the outside world doesn't feel safe or certain for them. And as if all of that was not enough, the primary care providers, yourselves, you are also tired. You're also overcommitted. You also have many demands. Many of you are in leadership positions. A lot of times for leaders in today's environment, those pressures, those difficulties are coming to your doorstep. So you are also exerting a lot more energy and giving a lot more of yourself. So in many ways, adolescents today are experiencing a bit of the perfect storm, as evidenced by many objective measures, many individual measures, many quantitative measures, and many, many qualitative and lived experience measures. And all of that adds up to a potential for increased trauma, a potential for increases in behaviors that we'll discuss in a few minutes, which can lead to a lot of pain and suffering for the adolescents and by extension their families. Next slide, please.
So I want to talk a little bit about social media in adolescence. It's such a hot topic. It's a super easy thing to demonize. You know, we see our kids holding their phones all the time, as we do. But I really want to point out that the research shows mixed effects on mental health. So on the one hand, for example, cyberbullying is a significant problem and really affects kids in a deep way. So if that's happening, I really encourage you to step in and take care of that, because a lot of kids are suffering quietly about that, and that's an important thing to check in about. Of course, research shows it can contribute to negative body image and social comparison, which again, the other piece we always hear about is FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. And of course, watching people post the best of their lives, those snapshots, those moments, can lead to feelings of inadequacy if one has a tendency to compare themselves, which adolescents do. I will say, though, that it does offer opportunities for social support and self-expression. The online communities that exist are kind of like the new mall. It's a place where kids can hang out. It's a place where they can gather, where they can't actually gather physically without, being accused of loitering. It's a place for them to try on new identities and do some trial and error risk taking. And I think, I always consider when they're in our homes a really wonderful time for us to allow for more trial and error, because we're there to help them when they fall, when there's that error. It is important that we help kids take breaks from their phones and help them think critically and rationally about the effect it's having on them. And I would encourage you to have an open, non-judgmental, ongoing conversation. What do you notice about when you use your phone? I think kids could easily say, yeah, I feel terrible. And yet they're drawn to it. So helping them take breaks, helping them look at cause and effect is such a great opportunity for you as a parent, but also to look at your own use. See how, if you're sort of preoccupied and looking at the phone when you're with them, what messages are you sending by your own behavior, not just by your words, but by your own behavior. These are opportunities as they're getting older to talk with them, engage with them about these really important topics like social media. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to move into sort of understanding parent-child relationships. Next slide.
So as we hear this presentation, we can think of three distinct zones. We can think of our children as part of a childhood. And as I mentioned earlier, typically this would be from ages 0 to 13, sometimes 0 to 12 or 0 to 10, but it's a distinct phase. In this phase, the parents are the primary supports. They're the primary supports logistically, housing, food, support, but also on an emotional level. They are who we turn to for all or most of our needs. What is happening in adolescence, and again, keeping in mind the conveyor belt of biology, where their hormones are changing, their brains are maturing, their physical bodies are changing, their conceptualization of self is changing. So within that comes the increased autonomy. Now, this is where there's a sort of tension, because they still need our support. They're still living in our homes. They still don't have a credit card. They may have very limited access to finances or transportation. So we are now starting to enter into a phase of both, where they need our support, but within their systems, they want increased autonomy. This can create both tension, but also an opportunity for an engagement in a different way, a different level, in a way that responds to what they need. Finally, we're not going to be adolescents forever. We are eventually going to transition to adulthood. We're eventually going to have greater parity in the relationship. We're eventually going to have better understanding and in many ways a better acceptance of each other. But at the time of adolescence, with the changes that we have discussed previously, is the time of the most heightened awareness that, hey, we're in the midst of this change. This will constantly look unstable until adulthood reaches. Now, as they enter into adolescence, there's stability. In the middle of it, there's a fair bit of instability. And as they re-enter into adulthood, there's stability. But if you're even aware of it, and if you keep it in mind, then the things that may come up, either the interactions, verbal, emotional, or even the lack of interactions, they will be in a better context and you'll have a better understanding of them. Next slide, please. So if we think about what happened, we all experienced COVID. So other than our births, other than our eventual passings, this is one of the only shared experiences we've all had. So what is happening at this time is there's much more fatigue. What is happening at this time is much more fear. What's happening at this time is much more uncertainty, and resulting from that, all of the above will be greater confusion, greater disempowerment. And so these are things that we want to keep in mind as we think about children, especially in a post-COVID-19 world. As I said, with the fatigue, that we also, our resources are also at one of the lowest points. So in these ways, adolescents are less empowered in some ways in terms of what is said to them on social media, but more empowered in other ways. So we have to think about how that plays into the balance and where are our children at that moment. They may be doing well, but they may be wondering whether we have higher expectations of them. They may not be doing well, but our love and our support allows them to feel that groundedness. So although they're more exposed than ever, it often feels like they're more disconnected than ever. And why is that? As we said, more instability in the world with greater uncertainty. So what is needed, and we will go deeper into the solutions part, is not just greater support, not just greater communication, but also a greater awareness of them and a greater awareness of ourselves. With that combination, which we'll discuss further, we can maintain that connection and the best parts of it in a way that's evolving and in a way that can be salient. Next slide, please.
I seem to be muting myself more than I would wish to, but I wanted to talk about the research that I think is so helpful to understand as a parent in terms of how to protect and support your adolescent's mental health. And I do think that it's also really hopeful research, which I'm going to get into in a moment. So one of the things that I have done a lot of work in, both clinically and in research, is looking at the benefits and the definition and practice of a secure parent and child relationship. And by parent-child, that also speaks to parents and adolescents. So child developmental research has shown that a child's secure attachment has these lifelong mental health, academic, peer and partner relationship, and health benefits. And to define a secure relationship, what we also have learned from research is that it's one in which the child feels that the parent can receive and tolerate their feelings of distress, respond in an attuned and a supportive way, which then supports their emotional and behavioral regulation. So let's just think a little bit about that for a minute, because, one of the things that we all know from our own experience is that it's much easier to sit with our children's experience when they're feeling excited, happy, good, etc. However, it's much more complicated when our children are angry, maybe even rageful, right? Rejecting us, bringing up things with us that make us feel our own feelings of worry. And yet what we know is that if you can be connected to your own feelings and have had a chance to process your own feelings related to distress, you're going to be much more likely to be able to hold and receive your child's experiences. So there's two research tools that have really importantly looked at the phenomenon of whether a parent can process and connect with difficult feelings. And one is called the adult attachment interview, which looks at a parent's experience in childhood of their own experience of being parented. And then the parent development interview, which is a research instrument that looks at parents' relationship with their children. And what we have seen is that a parent who can create what we think of as a coherent narrative about their own early experiences from childhood. And what that means is that they've been able to think about the difficult experiences and feelings they've had. They haven't dismissed those experiences or minimized them, but they've thoughtfully processed them. So these parents are more likely to be able to identify and respond to their children in an attuned way and the difficult feelings that they will inevitably be having as part of their adolescent journey. Next slide. Sorry, I just was going to the next slide. So one of the things that we know from this research is that helping children feel psychologically safe with their parents comes from this ability that parents have to slow down and be reflective and be responsive to their child's feelings. So this is a protective factor for their child's mental health, right? It protects against depression and anxiety in children. It also protects against this at-risk behavior, potentially. One of the things we also know is that parents who can increase their own reflective capacity are more likely to help their child increase theirs. So again, parents who are identifying and attuning to these feelings are able to help their adolescents connect up with, make sense of, and express their feelings in words rather than in these risky behaviors. So one very important way that parents can increase their own reflective capacity is this idea of building awareness of thoughts and feelings in a curious and non-judgmental way. So again, this ability to slow down and reflect, and I think again about, a hot button issue that Liz was talking about related to social media, it can be very difficult for parents to slow down when they're sped up. And yet when we're sped up, we're more likely to do things that we regret, either in our expressions verbally or in our behavior. And so the idea that we can take a moment to pause, identify the feeling we're having and that maybe our child may be having. And again, social media is a great one because on the surface, it may look like defiance, but underneath, we know there's a lot of vulnerability. We know that's why children are reaching out through social media to find their tribe, to identify with other people who are like themselves. So parents who are able to slow down and make these connections are much more likely to protect their relationship with their child against some of the distress that's caused in negative and toxic parental cycles, including out of control anger. Next slide.
I actually want to say a little bit more about reflective capacity because I just love, Wendy, what you're talking about. People who know me, who have worked with me, know that how much I really want to help people understand what does it mean, mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. I'll tell you that it is the ability to practice when you're sitting in meditation. It's not about having a good meditation. It's about knowing what's inside, non-judgmental awareness, observing, allowing, accepting what arises. And that practice is exactly what you bring in as a parent. That is what it is. So I really encourage you, if you want to practice that, to be aware that that's what you're doing in life, is coming into these moments where your children, inevitably we have issues that are going to come up from our childhood. Maybe you were bullied as a kid, maybe you were on the outside. I work with moms and dads who talk about, being terrified of adolescence because of what they remember from their experience. And so it's every stage, maybe there was trauma during that period of time, but every stage of raising children is an opportunity to stabilize yourself, to grow internally. And the reflective capacity is just such a hugely important skill. So I'm so excited that we're talking about that. So we're going to talk about warning signs, and feel free to interact. Okay, those of you out there, I see some hearts, so that's great, and I'm glad that people can resonate with what I'm talking about. I want to say one more thing about biology piece it's very important to know that at these reproductive moments, like the onset of menstruation, pregnancy, menopause, at these moments, these are when the hormones are really shifting, and some people are very sensitive to that shift. So you may see girls have their first experience with depression around puberty. And oftentimes I talk to women who, let's say, begin to feel depression or anxiety postpartum or during pregnancy. And yes, sure enough, that happened when they first started their period, but it was unrecognized, undiagnosed. So it's an important thing to pay attention to. So next slide. So at every stage of development, kids have different anxieties, different worries, different vulnerabilities. Anxious teenagers are worried about different things than anxious children, right? So they're not worried about the dark necessarily or monsters. They're really more worried about themselves. And some of the things that they worry about, well, let me back up. Some kids, you'll see they were anxious as little kids, but they could still function. And so you just kind of managed it. And then as they become a teenager, it flares up in a stronger way, in a different way, in a more intense way. Other kids, maybe they even got treatment. You help them and it comes again in adolescence. And some kids were absolutely not anxious kids. And then that puberty switch and all of the responsibilities and the new things, as more is expected of them, and they develop more of a focus on their peers, then there's a sort of adolescent onset of anxiety. So it is quite common. I hear about a lot of anxiety these days. This is a very anxious time for humans in general. So I think Wendy made a good point. It's really important. We sometimes kind of want to make fun of kids who are so, obsessed with looking in the mirror, or, I don't want anyone to see me with you. And we try to rationalize with them and tell them, you're smarter than that, or it doesn't matter. But reality is this is part of the drive of development and biology. So it's important that we don't try to rationalize them out or mock them about this. So they are, when it comes to performance, I want to talk about that. I think something that I discovered as a mom, which really surprised me, is that even when a parent or parents, whether you're a single parent or in a couple, even if you're not pressuring your kids about grades, they can feel intense pressure in the social environment. And that's a real thing, even though you may feel like, I don't ever do that. So where's this coming from? And that impact of the social environment is very big. Kids go through thinking about how they're perceived, right? All teens go through a phase of self-consciousness and focus on their appearance in some form. For some kids, it is just exponentially stronger. They might be worried about being seen as incompetent or stupid or doing something embarrassing. These are really significant anxieties. Their bodies are a topic of anxiety. Those physical changes can be uncomfortable and awkward. As Sanchit said, their bodies are developing at different rates. So a teen can feel out of step if their peer group is ahead of them or behind them. So looking at what kinds of things come up, avoidance is really important to address. We know with anxiety disorders that avoidance is like the fuel to the fire. It's the gas. The more you avoid, it actually reinforces the anxiety. So it's really important that kids develop that skill. It's a life skill. And I'm sure all of you as adults know how important it is to learn how to manage and not avoid. It's not a black and white thing. I am not saying that you should always be pushing your child to never avoid. But as we like to say, we want to avoid avoiding as much as possible. Kids, have the same kind of experience, I think, that I hear a lot of adults talk about. You get in bed, you finally have a moment, it's quiet, and that's when all the worries show up. So all the things you haven't had a chance to think about, and it happens to teens as well, which, when you see your kid not being able to get off the phone at night, it may be related to that. They're trying to distract. So it's really important to be curious and open in talking with your kids about what's going on with them. And of course, when there's excessive worry and you can't sleep, that's going to exacerbate anxiety. It's a vicious cycle. Physical symptoms such as muscle tension, headaches, stomach aches, difficulty breathing, or just feeling tired. These are things that are manifestations of anxiety that kids may not even know is related to anxiety. It may seem like an illness, but it's actually anxiety. So even things like, when kids have stomach issues and maybe they don't want to go to school because they don't want to have to go to the bathroom. Nobody wants to have a bowel movement in high school. That's just a thing. So I hear. So those kinds of things are like locked inside a lot, and it's important to be open and allow kids to talk about, what concerns they might have. Perfectionism is really, I think, a very painful thing to see in your child, at least in my experience and the parents I've talked to. And I really want to encourage, of course, I want to encourage all of you to address all of these things, but excessive self-criticism is really bad for your brain chemistry. It takes its toll over time. Sometimes people think they have to be tough on themselves to get themselves motivated. And I would posit that actually is not a motivator. That ends up being a demoralizer. So learning how to be able to appropriately, want to do better, but also recognize what is done well is so important. Next slide.
And Liz, there's a great question on the Q&A, or there's a comment about anxiety that would be worth maybe speaking to.
Yes, thank you.
Also some other questions we'll get to around the intergenerational transmission of trauma and how we think about that.
Okay. Wait, do you want to tell me what the question is?
So there's someone saying, I would also add that anxiety itself is not a malfunction, but the brain doing what it is designed to.
Thank you. Yes, that is very true. Anxiety, we're all going to have it. And in this world right now, there's a lot of things that produce fear and anxiety. And of course, if you're watching the news, that is the business model, to create as much fear and anxiety as possible. So you keep watching. So I'm glad you made that point. Not all anxiety is disordered. What I want to say about this is if you're feeling like you're seeing this and it's going on and it's really getting in the way of their functioning, that's when you need to think about taking care of it. You might see, blips of different things or anxious moments, anxious times, but it's when it really gets in the way of like doing what they need to do or enjoying their life. That's when it's a problem. It's not a problem in and of itself. So nightmares and restless sleep are commonly reported by anxious teens, and we all have those, right? The ones where you dream that you were in high school or college and you forgot to study for an exam or whatever it is. Those can be kind of signals, but sometimes it's ongoing. Again, when it reaches a threshold where it's ongoing and it's starting to get into interfere, that's when it's important to take a look at it and do something about it. Irritability, being anxious is stressful. There's so much going on in kids that certainly anxiety can make them more irritable and sensitive. Performance and concentration, that's a tough one too, because I think a lot of teens perhaps have experiences where they studied, really well and they're prepared. You've seen them study and then they get to the test and they don't do well because they were so anxious about it that they couldn't manage their anxiety. So when you start to see that stuff, this infiltrating in different parts of their lives, it's important to take action. Reassurance seeking is a slippery slope. While we really, of course, want to reassure people and tell them, that their thoughts are unreasonable, that's not going to happen, or we want to calm them. This is one of, in adolescence, OCD certainly can occur. And one of the hallmarks of OCD is repetitive asking for reassurance, seeking validation. So if you suspect OCD, I just want to say, well, for all of these anxiety issues, there is some really good treatment. And to catch it is such a gift to catch it early and help them have some coping strategies. Next slide. Okay, so, if you yourself have an anxiety disorder or it's in your family, just be aware this is a health issue, just like when you go to the doctor and they ask you what other kind of conditions in your family, whether it be cancer or heart disease. It's really important that people know what kind of mental health issues are in their family tree, if you can, and just be mindful of that. Certainly traumatic experiences, and in the United States, we see a lot of stuff, especially now because we do have access to social media. You see people freaking out, pulling out guns, mass shootings. There's a lot out there. And we have to really check in with our kids about how they're dealing with that, how they're experiencing it. Chronic medical conditions, certainly, that is quite a load for someone to carry, for a child to carry, and that could definitely increase their risk. The stress in the family is an important thing, and I think this is a really, I want to appeal to you to think about your home life and about your relationships and what it's like, to step back and think about what it's like in the environment that your child is living in. Lastly, personality traits. You see these as, when they're younger, things like being shy or a tendency to overthink. These are things that can increase someone's risk of developing an anxiety disorder. Next slide.
Okay, I'm going to speak to this and how depression looks in teens. And one of the things is I want to just say there's some really, again, great questions coming up in the quick Q&A. Some of these for sure we will get to in our sort of 30-minute post-presentation discussion. I did see, though, something that's really related here to anxiety before we get into depression. Someone was asking about, along the lines of perfectionism, do we have specific recommendations around navigating the intense college application admission process and the inevitable and devastating rejection that comes with it? And Liz, I don't know if you want to save that till the Q&A, or if you have anything or Sanchit that you'd like to say. I had a couple of thoughts.
I guess one thing I would like to add, which I think is wonderful, is if you can find examples to introduce your children to people who had different kinds of career paths, who maybe didn't go to their first choice college and still are happy and living wonderful lives. It's really easy in our society to have this really narrow view of what success is. And kids are getting bombarded with that all the time. So it doesn't have to be one route. And even if they say, I know, but I have to go to college, just showing them real life examples, I think, it gets in there somewhere. That's what I would add.
I was also thinking about how our culture reinforces for parents as well that their kid has to go not just to college, but to a certain kind of college to be successful. And so I do think it's a really important reflective practice as you are approaching that whole experience, to really reflect on what are your beliefs and values that may underlie, the meaning of a certain kind of college, or not getting into a certain kind of college. What are your own experiences with rejection? How devastating or catastrophic were they? How did you cope with those experiences? I think really reflecting on those experiences in yourself, also that's really important to be able to then share with your child, but also then just sort of also know that we can survive and thrive and also learn resilience, right, from disappointment. The other thing I was going to say is kind of right-sizing your child's admission process. So how many colleges do they really need to apply to? Do they need to keep retaking these standardized tests? I think, again, sometimes we see parents and kids get into such a kind of a sticky loop cycle in their minds of what they have to do or what score they have to get in order to be successful.
Can I just also jump in, Wendy? There's a question about reflective capacity, an example, and I think you just gave a really good one, which is let's say your kid is just so focused on this one college, and you're feeling so anxious, like, oh my God, they're going to be devastated. that's a moment to step back and have some reflection on your own feelings and do some of that work. So there's just one example, because, and in that moment, in any given moment, we might be flooded with a lot of our own feelings about their feelings, and to be able to slow down so that we can be careful about how we respond. If we're too flooded, we're going to be out of what we call the window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is where we can think and talk and say things that, make sense, as opposed to being impulsive, say things you're going to regret, being taken away by your feelings, to kind of keep yourself into that regulated place, even if that means taking a timeout and saying, I need to stop this conversation right now, or, let's pick this up another time. So I just wanted to pull that in as an example.
Yeah, that's right.
And I also wanted to add, the question did ask about recommendations. As we think about what those recommendations may be, and I completely agree with Wendy and Liz about various ways we have dealt with those experiences or other options and opportunities, we want to constantly have empathy for what they're experiencing. So staying with those feelings that they're experiencing, because we may have perspective that this may not be the most important thing of life, and eventually they'll come to that point. But in that moment, this is their life. And especially, and we'll talk a little bit about self-harm in a few minutes, but especially if it's conjoined to a sense of self-worth. If I don't get this, I might as well not be alive. Or if I don't get this, my sense of purpose is gone. So staying with that empathy and starting it almost with every conversation, because that one time on a Sunday evening, it might have been really good and our child may have understood it. But on Wednesday, when they found out their friend got into Caltech or their friend got into Cambridge, that might be a new round of difficulty, pain. And so meeting them where they're at, as we do in motivational enhancement therapy, and revisiting, sitting with them can go a long way to helping them both feel an amelioration of their pain, but also maintaining a sense of connection.
And I think, again, about what a great example of parental reflective capacity that could be too. I mean, I think, when we're thinking about being reflective, it's about our own states of mind, beliefs, thoughts, and feelings, and those of our kids, and the connection and separateness between those experiences. So I think about, sometimes as a parent, like you said, we have that perspective, and we may feel like, oh, this is going to turn out okay. And I think a lot of parents offer reassurance. However, I think sometimes that can really miss speaking more and connecting more deeply with what you're saying, Sanchit, about the child's deeper experience. And so being able to be reflective is holding your experience, your child's experience, connecting those, knowing they're separate, and being able to one, knowing it internally, and then hopefully also being able to speak to your child's experience, being able to speak to, I can see that you are feeling so worried that a rejection would mean this about who you are or what your opportunities are. And I'm here to be with you through this incredibly difficult process. So, and I know that we're going to keep talking again about sort of the intergenerational piece of things as well, and how do we stay connected. But how does depression look in teens? Well, we've talked a lot about it already. I think, again, that sometimes it's a little bit of a slippery slope, or, a lot of parents, I think, come to see me as a psychologist, and they've been noticing some things over time, little bits here and there, that some grades weren't so great last semester, or he wanted to drop out of that sport. And it's a little bit of a slow drip. And then all of a sudden it feels like there's a kind of cluster of things going on, and they're like, I'm worried. And I think about, again, just noticing and being aware of changes in your child's demeanor, activity level, right? And again, not necessarily coming to them with alarm, because again, our alarm is a more reactive state. It's maybe a fight, flight, or freeze response of our own. But again, coming to our teens with curiosity, right? And now it's really hard to come to your team with curiosity sometimes if they're using alcohol or drugs, right? Or if they've stopped showering, or if their behaviors seem really sort of offensive or worrisome to a certain degree. But again, in terms of maintaining the connection, being able to wonder with them and notice, I'm really seeing that there's this change. I'm curious to understand more. Tell me what your experience has been like in soccer, what's been happening. And again, maybe they won't have a lot to say, but I do think sometimes with adolescents, even though they may not speak to you sometimes about their feelings, they want you to know, and they want you to stay close. As much as they may look like they want you to stay far away, that's the sort of tug of war of adolescence. They really, really need you to be paying attention.
And I just also jump in, Wendy, I love what you just said. And I do want to say that I think with, successful high performing adults who are parents, there is a tendency to get into problem solving mode. So when you're listening, there's an energy of, what is it? I want to fix it. Or how can I help? And in that kind of example about what's it like on the soccer team, it's going to be really important to practice just listening and not giving advice. And of course, we this is something that comes up with couples all the time as well. But there is a time for just listening and taking in what they're saying. And that also means feeling it. So when they tell you somebody was mean to them or they felt embarrassed, you may have all kinds of reactions, but being able to kind of just allow it to come and go, those feelings, and then decide, do you want some help with that? Do you want my input? But to be able to be respectful that way, instead of coming in trying to solve or rescue them, is such an important part for them to develop trust in being able to talk to you. Because if every time they talk to you, you're giving them advice, they're not going to want to talk.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about going to the next slide. Maybe Senshit, this is something just to be thinking about. Someone has asked, how can we help an adolescent who does not want to talk about her pain and distress when they want to solve their own problems and issues themselves and don't believe adults can help?
Yeah, it's actually very nicely related to this slide. Specifically about the question, one of the themes that we're hearing today is trying to maintain an open connection, an open communication channel. Whatever we can do to put guardrails for ourselves and for them, that would be helpful. So part of that open communication channel is our children having a faith that we're going to meet them where they're at. So if they're requesting advice, that's great. But oftentimes they will say, I just wanted to be heard. Or I didn't want to come tell you this because I know I might get a lecture from you. We don't see it that way. We don't even mean it that way. We may even just have said 2 or 3 sentences. But sometimes, depending on their state of angst, that's how they may hear it. They may do a sort of meta thinking about us. Well, I thought you would be disappointed in me. And you're going to rack your brains and you're going to say, when did I ever say that? I've always said, I believe in you. I love you. I care about you. I'm here for you. But that's how they may think. Well, you and dad are so successful. You and dad, it's always easy for you. And I just am not like that. Well, they don't know everything. So maintaining an open communication channel, meeting them where they're at, and reassuring them that this is part of the process may be helpful to maintaining that communication pathway. However, there are times that even with our best intentions, those things may not happen. You've just heard about anxiety and depression. And when we think about the ultimate fear of every parent, we think about them being concerned about safety, about well-being, and there are obviously external aspects to that, such as accidents or other things. But we also have grave concerns for internal aspects. So as you think about your kids and you have concerns, definitely seeking out the assistance of a professional, seeking it out quickly would be very helpful. Because what we want to avoid, And unfortunately, there seems to be a epidemic of this and of highest numbers. What we want to avoid is our children going towards a place where they don't feel there's any hope for them, that the only solution is a permanent solution and an ending of life. How do we know this? Well, we're not professionals, but we'll have a vantage point as parents that can add to what a professional can do in their assessment. So if our child has undergone previous attempts, if there's a family history, if they have had intensity and acuity of mental health needs that have exceeded friends, family, their primary care providers, and they need things like inpatient care. If we're seeing our children struggling with substance use disorders, or we have seen in a high school that there was a suicide of somebody, even if our child didn't know them very well, but to avoid the contagion effect. Another big area of warning, of monitoring, of concern, of vigilance is when there are quick changes, significant, rapid changes. What would be an example? So breakups. When we are younger, we meet someone and we have such an intense response, a hormonal response, a physical response, a visceral response. But if we connect with that person so well and we think this person is everything, and somewhere along the way, they don't feel the same about us, or somewhere along the way, they decide they have to pursue a different path, that can be quite devastating. We heard a lot about social media. And so if somebody is in that place of experiencing cyber difficulties or bullying, those are areas of concern also. And definitely, if the child has said things to us such as, well, I may be better off dead, or, well, you and dad have my brother, and so you'll be fine, and he seems to be doing really well. So those type of things where they start hinting at wanting to end their life, or even they share plans with you, those are the times to seek acute, urgent, emergent medical care, whether it's 911 in America, whether it is taking the child to an emergency department or having other crisis resources activated. So those are things that you can do about it. But overall, think about big changes, think about the baseline, think about family history, trust your intuition. If you're feeling there's something up, talking with your child, if you don't feel that they're at that place, then having an objective person evaluate them can be very helpful. Next slide, please.
Okay, so some recommendations. Go ahead. Next slide.
So here we are. So we've heard a lot today, but the fact that you're even plugged into this seminar really shows you care. And what does that mean? It shows that you love your kids. It shows that you believe in empathy, that you want to build on it, you want to grow in it, you want to be connected to them. It shows that you want to put the work in. You value ongoing communication that's bidirectional. You value being a good listener. You value also being a good mentor and advisor, but you also value giving them space. Sometimes, as we said earlier, they just need to be heard. They don't need any advice. They don't want that. They don't want any judgment. They just need to know that they could come home to this safe space of their home, their room, at their kitchen table, and their loved ones will receive them and say, hey, how's it going? What's going on with you today? And just listening. And everyone here also thinks a lot about logistics. So you are already doing many of the things. So the goal with this slide is to almost affirm that you've already laid a foundation. We all have different challenges. We all have different situations. So adding on one more, you need to do more, you're not doing enough, is not helpful. But in another way, to think, we've already created this tremendous foundation. Each of these can be further tweaked, and we want to do it based on our energy. We want to do it based on our resources. But just keep this one in mind, that you're already doing what is part of the foundation. Next slide, please.
Okay, I think this next slide will also help us answer some of the questions on the Q&A. So I think what is really wonderful is that how we were parented does not define our ability to parent in a more reflective way. And, there's a question on the Q&A about whether trauma is passed down through genes and, what is the role of environment? And what we know from research is that intergenerational trauma can be interrupted by intentional reflective work. So what that means is that it's not that it doesn't matter what happened to you when you were a child, but at the same time, in terms of your ability to be a reflective, attuned, connected parent to your child, the work that you do now to be able to make sense of the feelings that may have come up in your own experiences of being parented will absolutely interrupt. When I think about trauma, I think about the inability to process, tolerate, respond to acute feelings of distress, fear, rejection, guilt, right? All of those really hard feelings. So again, the more work we've done, the more space we have to be able to connect with our child about those feelings. So I've said here in this slide, the idea of tolerating emotional discomfort, living with uncertainty. And Senshit talked to that earlier, right? That our children are living in such states of uncertainty, which is, again, it's ordinary and not ordinary. I think, again, we can't read our child's mind, but what we can do is learn to understand and appreciate that they are having all kinds of feelings that we may or may not know in any given moment, but we can certainly be curious and open and aware that they're having a very rich and profound internal life. Someone mentioned in the chat as well that they find it easier to be reflective with their own children, but much harder to be reflective with their own parents, and wanted us to speak to that. So one of the things that came to my mind is that, our ability to be reflective is absolutely impacted by our environment and our experience. So if we're under stress, we're less likely to be reflective and more likely to be reactive. If our parents were less able to connect with and reflect on our own difficult feelings or feelings at all, we might find it really challenging to be around them because we don't feel that sense of psychological safety. We don't feel like we can fully relax and be ourselves in their presence. I do think that being able, I think there's a lot of work that goes into finding ways to, and again, this is a tricky thing to say in a way, but accept our parents for who they are as human beings and their limitations. And that's a lifelong journey, I think. But again, I feel like people who can do some preparation for when they come into contact with their parents, there's always a child in all of us, I think, who's looking for that repair or looking for that acknowledgement from their parent about an experience. And sometimes it doesn't come. And there's grief and loss associated with that. And I think, again, about finding ways to process some of that grief and loss. So I think, again, the ability to reflect on feelings, those of your child, again, it increases that feeling of the sense of emotional safety, and you're less likely to react or act out those feelings yourself. The next slide. I think we've talked a lot about this, and I want to make sure we have time for more Q&A. I think that, again, the sort of take home is a lot of parents, I think, feel stuck when their child says, I don't need help and I'm not going to go see a therapist, or I'm not going to get. And that's where I really encourage parents to go and meet with a therapist themselves who can do that kind of parent work, who's with you to help you think about, are there barriers that you're having emotionally to creating a boundary with your child around the need for some additional support? I think about being able to say to your adolescent, I know that you don't want support, but I feel like I need some support. I'm going to go meet with somebody who can really help me think about what's happening for you. And because I love you and I care about you and I want to help. And I do think adolescents really look at us as parents and they're like, well, she's got some problems, or what's going on with her? Well, how come I'm the one who's the identified patient? So again, it's really modeling that to our adolescents that we're also able to be vulnerable. We're able to look at our own stretches as parents and human beings. So I think, again, that's incredibly, incredibly powerful and important. Okay, next slide. So we have some resources here around when and how to get help. Now, this is more US based. However, I do think that these websites are, of course, available to anybody. I just wanted to say, in the United States, we now have the Suicide and Crisis Chat line, 988, for anyone. If you also are a parent and are concerned, you can text or call. You don't have to be the person who is actively suicidal to make the most of that resource. These resources I wrote here, the websites have fantastic resources, printouts, information, anything you could really want to educate yourself on depression and anxiety in adolescence. The other thing I'd say is that no matter where you are in the world, asking your community, often schools, vice principals, school counselors will have recommendations for therapists in your community. Reaching out to Mobius, reaching out to your employer. As the world is becoming more aware of this adolescent crisis, there's a lot more, I think, flexibility and mobility towards getting adolescents the help they need.
Yeah, and with the technology that we have now, there's so many more online therapy options, which makes it much easier too. So I encourage people to think about that. Okay, so we have our last few minutes of Q&A. I think we've gotten through most of the questions. Anything you want to add, Sancha, to this?
And there's one question we haven't, I think, answered, but yeah.
You're on mute.
One of the ways we should keep thinking about this is that this is going to be a dynamic journey. So how they are at 13 will be different at 14. What are their external resources? What social networks are they a part of? What experimentation are they engaged in? So many of these things are going to require us to also be evolving and flexible and meeting them where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see a question here about how do we help children, really develop that ability to sort of self-steer and develop their mental health, right? And in a way that they can rely on. And I really encourage parents to really start to talk more about your own experiences, even if it's during the day, right? What happened to you today that brought up a feeling? How did you think about it? How did you handle it? Because I think, again, it's so important for kids to see their parents reflecting and thinking about the links between feelings and behavior and stressors. And I think, again, if you can share that, you can also be curious with your child. You were feeling, you were feeling so disappointed, that you didn't make the team. I totally understand that feeling. Tell me more. What did it, tell me more about what it meant to you. And I don't know if I've ever shared this story with you, about this time when I didn't make it. I think, again, kids are so hungry often to hear stories, lived experiences that their parents have had. So that's one way. And then there's this other question about how would we recommend helping teens find their purpose and profession in cases where there is complete lack of motivation and interests.
I want to say one piece about that is I think that it's important that we, as Sanchit said, these are phases. There are phases that kids go through, and right now is such a difficult time, I think, for people who are trying to figure out what they're going to do in the future. We've just come out of this lockdown time. The world is just really confusing and different. And I think if we can just slow down and not panic in those kind of situations where there's a lack of motivation, and to sort of take it slow. Wendy, I'm curious, since you work with a lot of teens, what do you think about this?
I mean, I think that for me, when I've encountered this, I have often ended up feeling like that teen may be experiencing some real depression, and I think sometimes getting the help of a professional who can help you as a parent kind of track back, when's the last time you remember your kid being more connected or interested? Was there some major change that in their life? Really sort of tracking the story. And I think, again, rather than kind of staying in the kind of, well, the sort of top level, more intellectual focus on interests, connecting up more with the feelings and seeing if there's a pathway through feelings to make some sense of what's happening. I think often, some teens are depressed and they don't feel like they see a pathway for themselves. And just getting through the day is hard enough. So again, some of these future forward conversations are really tough.
And on that note too, I want to say about depression, sometimes there's this like, why would you be depressed? Everything is going so well for you, or you have everything you need. And what is there to be depressed about? So it's really important people understand that this is an illness that is biologically based, and there are, it can happen regardless of the conditions around you. So it's really important to not be coming with that attitude, because it also, one of the symptoms is guilt, and kids can feel really like, what's wrong with me? That it really exacerbates depression.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here about, in general, when research was mentioned, is this for typical adolescents, or any data, thoughts, or research about teens who are already vulnerable? And I think that, what I'd say is that, in these sort of bigger research studies, whether, I think, in the recent ones we've seen pulled by the CDC, and it's not that they haven't spoken specifically, I think, to the experience of teens with disabilities or neurodivergence. However, as a practitioner, I can tell you that I think the world is not very friendly, or sometimes set up to provide safe spaces for people for minorities, as we know, for people who are neurodivergent. I have many kids who are neurodivergent in my practice, and I definitely think that their experience is profoundly often neglected, I think, by our school systems, by our larger culture in general. And and what is wonderful is I do think there's a lot of advocacy within the neurodivergent communities, really trying to have their voice be heard. But again, we need to sort of think about, how do we make more inclusive spaces for every voice? There's one here about phone use. Oh yeah, you were typing an answer to that one, Liz. Okay. Someone's bringing up lying. I was just going to say about, lying in general. Lying is a very ordinary thing that happens in childhood and adolescence. I know it's very distressing as a parent, but again, I think if we can kind of step back and imagine, again, what is the child lying about, and what could be the meaning of the lying, right? What is it that they're trying to solve for themselves in this way, right? Are they desperately looking for more attention? More connection? Are they really insecure that if they're not on their phone, they're going to be kicked out of their tribe in a way, right? Their primary source of connection. So I think, again, trying to have that deeper connection with what may be going on, and also being consistent and collaborative and predictable with your limits, right? I certainly think that most kids and teenagers can absolutely collaborate with you on a reasonable plan around social media. And then I think it's about, how do we stick to the guidelines, and how do parents continue to be consistent?
One other thing I'll just add about, something like lying, as you alluded to, Wendy, it's an opportunity for a conversation, because clearly there were some needs that the teenager was pursuing, and clearly there was some fear of either not being able to get those needs met through honesty, or a fear of maybe judgment. So in some ways, as painful as it could be, as difficult as it could be really seen as, well, this is a opportunity, unintentional, maybe inadvertent, maybe, for us to get on the same page, get to know each other better, and find ways that we could meet those needs, have a better understanding, without there be a compromise of trust.
And I think there's a moment for reflective capacity. When you hear that your child has lied to you, that can push a lot of buttons, and you may feel angry, and that's an important time to kind of look at what that means for you, and to work through your feelings before addressing it with your child.
Right. Feeling
Hey, how are we doing on time? Are we time to wrap up? Wendy, did you want to add something? Sorry, before we go.
That's okay. I mean, I was just going to say about that feeling of betrayal that parents can experience. And again, I would say that anytime you're experiencing a very difficult, powerful feeling in yourself, it's really helpful to kind of jump back to the last moment you felt that in your life. Or do you have those memories for yourself from earlier in your experience as an adolescent? Because again, the ripple effects of these feelings are very powerful. And it's very easy to get more rigid and inflexible. And the idea of reflection is that it's going to help you be more flexible in your responsiveness, right, to your child, and help you think through feelings which your child may be having a hard time doing themselves, right? And we need to be able to think through feelings, theirs and our own, in order to have the appropriate responses in the moment.
We have about 4 or 5 minutes if anyone wants to add some questions or anything. Sanchit or Wendy, do we want to?
One thing I just want to reiterate, which I've said before, parenting is one of the most fulfilling experiences in life, but it can also be one of the most challenging. And you are holding many, many worlds in your hands, whether it's your professional work, whether it's yourself as an individual, as a person. So giving yourself a lot of compassion, a lot of empathy, a lot of understanding, knowing that you did your best. And yes, if you learned something on how to do it differently or a little bit better, great, wonderful. What a gift it is to have the rest of our lives with our children. So being mindful of that, because by nature as a parent, you're a default care provider. That's how your biology has shifted, to give, to give, to give. And that's wonderful. And our kids ultimately appreciate us, or even appreciate us in real time. But in real time, if you could also acknowledge that you're doing your best and you're also a person, you're also a human being, and giving yourself that grace and that space can also be helpful.
Yeah, I like that. And I would also add, I think it's a powerful opportunity for personal growth and development. We can't help but revisit certain places of pain in our own lives as we parent. At the same time, the joy of watching your child be who they are and really blossom is beautiful. And it's very painful during teens times, because they may be behind the door a lot and not want you around. But as there was an article in New York Times about being like a potted plant in the house, it's important to just be around. And even if they don't want to talk to you, knowing you're in the house, knowing you're around, you're available is such an important gift you can give to them.
Wonderful. Well, maybe I'll just come back on then and bring our panel to a close if I can, everybody. So first of all, let me extend our collective gratitude to Liz, to Wendy, to Sanchit. Thank you so much for being here and offering your wisdom and your expertise and your care for this issue. I'm still joined by Francesco from Egon Zehnder, as well as our other 2 sponsors. We have Gina and Rachel from Seven Stones Leadership and Cultivating Leadership. We're really so delighted that all of you were willing to join us in enabling this event to take place. And Gina, let me just invite you to bring us to a close. And then Rachel, I'll give you a chance to say a few words as well. And then we'll thank everybody in a final way.
Thank you, Amy. It was really a pleasure for us to be supportive of this conversation. Just as coaches and consultants, we are holding the space for our clients who are parenting teens. And as Liz said at the end, it's a great time to practice and bring all of our somatic knowing and practice into our life. And then the last thing I will just say, being on the other side of teens, is some of these and a lot of these issues continue into young adults. So if you think something's going to happen when they turn 20, disabuse yourself of that notion. So I just throw in some of my own parenting advice there, and just really thank you for taking the time to have this really important conversation.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you and Jen for your constant, generous collaboration over many years. Rachel, let me turn it over to you for a moment as well.
Thanks so much, Amy and Gina. This has been such a rich conversation. In addition to working with Cultivating Leadership, and we're thrilled to partner with you, spent 2 decades studying and working with and writing about adolescence. I've written several books about parenting adolescent girls. And so I want to throw out a couple of suggestions for parents of like just how to say it, which is kind of the world that I come from. So one great thing to say around social media is, I know you're going to make mistakes. It's not, don't type one thing that you wouldn't want your grandmother to see and your life will be over if she sees it. But like, I know you're going to screw up and I'm going to be here for you when you do, because you're learning something new, which is a deviation from the common line about social media, which is like, you have to be perfect, otherwise your life will end. Another great thing to say is, hey, and this is building on everything that the wonderful panelists have said, do you want to vent right now or do you want my advice? Like I'm willing to just let you kind of barf it all out. Sorry to not be very corporate. I will just let you do that and I will not say anything, or I can give you advice. You let them decide. And then finally, and I think people have been talking about this, and certainly at the very end, self-compassion is so key. The practice of self-compassion. I've written for the New York Times about the research on self-compassion in teenagers, and there's reams of it. And so all of this stuff around dealing with failure and dealing with chronic academic anxiety, just saying to yourself, it's okay to feel the way I feel. How would I talk to my best friend or someone I love if they were struggling with this? And I know I'm not alone. Those are the 3 steps, but you can probably follow up and find them online. Those kinds of practices and modeling it in front of your children. When you lose your keys, not beating yourself up and saying, I'm an idiot, but saying, people lose their keys, right? I'm like maxed out. That's why I lost my keys. So modeling those kinds of behaviors, that's the class that our kids are really paying attention to. It's tough out there though. It's brutal out there. And I'm really happy to have been able to learn so much from all of you. So thanks for having us at Cultivating Leadership as partners.
Wonderful. So delighted you were with us, Rachel. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to gather. It's always so touching when we come together as a community to share our love in this way. Our final request is to ask you to please, when we put up today's recording and the resources and slides on our LinkedIn and Facebook page, share it as widely as you can with your friends, with your colleagues, with your community members. We'd love to have this go as viral as possible as a resource for all the families who might be struggling or scared. Thank you for making the time. We're really, really delighted. And a final thank you, Liz, Wendy, Sanchit. I really appreciate your gathering and preparing and sharing with us all of your knowledge today. So thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a good day.